Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be in the world today. My name is Phil Goodwin. I'm a research director at IDC. IDC is a worldwide IT advisory and market research firm based in Framingham, Massachusetts. And we are very pleased to be participating in today's webinar sponsored by the LTO Consortium. The LTO Consortium is a cooperative industry trade group that establishes standards for the LTO tape products and is composed of vendors who manufacture or utilize the LTO tape products themselves. Before we get started, I'd like to address a few housekeeping items for you. First, this session is being recorded. A link to the recording will be automatically sent to you at the conclusion of the webinar. You are welcome to forward that link to a colleague who is not able to attend or use it for your own future reference. Second, you are welcome to submit a question at any time using the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your screen. All questions will be answered at the end of the formal presentation. Questions will be answered by a panel that includes Laura Laredo, a product manager from HPE, Carlos Sandoval, a program manager from IBM, and Eric Basir, a senior director from Quantum. Finally, I should note that IDC does not endorse any particular product or company, so nothing in this presentation should be considered as an endorsement. But our goal is to really provide educational and actionable guidance to IT managers in helping them to make informed technology deployment decisions. So let's go ahead and get started with today's presentation, and hopefully this will give you some food for thought as you develop your own IT strategy around data protection and malware protection in particular. And the title for today is How Tape Can Play a Key Part as a Total Data Protection Plan. Because really, if you look back at tape, and I have to confess, my involvement with tape goes all the way back to 1981, so it actually is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. But there's a lot of things that have changed in that time, and we certainly do at IDC get questions from end users and from our constituents as to the appropriate role of tape. So what I want to do in today's discussion is talk about really the situation analysis and the global data sphere and how that's affecting the amount of data that IT organizations need to deal with. Second, I want to identify some of the key use cases for tape. And also, among those, why tape is a primary defense against malware and ransomware. And that's a topic that is certainly, I think, top of mind for most people these days because it has become a serious threat. And we want to talk about some of the effective ways to thwart that malware and ransomware. And then finally, to talk about the value of tape as it fits into a cloud environment. Give you a little bit of business backdrop here. IDC research has found that about 60% of organizations will have a digital transformation strategy in place by 2020 and will be in the process of executing on it. We're finding digital transformation is a key initiative along with cloud-first initiatives for most organizations. And really the impetus for doing that is to focus on becoming a data-centric organization. So as digital transformation initiatives evolve, the key question that most of the IT leaders are asking is how do we turn our organization into a more data-centric organization to where they can be using timely data to drive informed decisions. Really the whole effort here is how do you go about gaining a competitive advantage? What are the things that the IT organization can utilize and deliver to the organization to help them to be more competitive and to help them be more agile as they navigate competitive waters. And really the issue here is what role does tape play in that digital transformation? Because if we're talking about timely decisions and gaining a competitive advantage, it does raise the question, where does tape play that role? And so that's what we want to be able to address today. If we look at the global data sphere, I think many of you will be familiar with the statistic of 44 zettabytes of data by, I think it was 2020 or somewhere in that ballpark. That was an IDC number that we developed and published several years ago, and it's been oft quoted in the media and in various presentations. This is an update to that number where we took a look to the global data sphere out through 2025 for our forecast, and we forecast that by 2025 we will be creating 163 zettabytes of data per year. But there are some important things that you need to understand about that from an IT organizational perspective. Certainly 163 zettabytes gets a lot of attention. It's going to get a lot of headlines, but there's more to it than that. That 163 zettabytes includes all the total amount of data that's being created, and we have 13 zettabytes of installed storage that will be utilized, and of that, 7.5 zettabytes of stored data by 2025. So let's dive into that a little bit further. If we dissect that global data sphere, we find that the 163 zettabytes of data is all created data, both stored and transient and from any source. So it could be a library book, it could be something on your cell phone or an IoT device, or really any kind of data or information that's created. And that's where we get down to the 13 zettabytes of installed data, or I'm sorry, of installed storage. And this is what we expect to see IT organizations having to deal with by 2025. Now, this includes all types of storage. It could be tape, could be hard disks, could be flash, cell phones, IoT devices. Really, bottom line, anything with storage on it is included in that 13 zettabyte number. So let's break that down a little bit further and say of that 13 zettabytes of installed storage, about 7.5 zettabytes will be stored data. This is what IT organizations are going to have to deal with specifically. And this compares to about 2.6 zettabytes in 2018. So we'll not quite triple, or just about triple, that amount of data between now and 2025. It's easy to say, wow, that's not much when you look at it in comparison to 163 zettabytes, but in reality that's millions of petabytes of data that IT organizations are going to have to deal with. And they're going to have to find a way to deal with it not only effectively, but within the cost constraints that an organization needs to deal with. So if we do a few more back-of-the-envelope calculations and dig into that 7.5 zettabytes a little bit further, if we assume that about 40% of that data is corporate data that needs to be captured, we'd bring it down further to 3.75 zettabytes. Then we can say that about 10% of that is hot, 30% of it is warm, and 60% of it is cold. Now, you can insert your own assumptions here. These are some of my assumptions, but certainly others may have assumptions that they would like to apply for their specific organization, and that would make sense. But the bottom line here is we have 2.2 zettabytes of data that is really logical for tape storage. That's a lot of storage. 2.25 million petabytes, I believe, is what that comes out to, of data that is fundamentally cold, meaning that our definition of cold is that it has less than a 50% likelihood of being retrieved within the next 30 days. Now, one other thing about the global data sphere is the nature of the data that is actually being secured. And what we see here is that within this data sphere, data is increasingly going to be requiring additional security. So what we did was broke this down into 5 different layers of types of data, which include privacy, compliance, custodial, confidential, and lockdown, and then applied that to the amount of data requiring security. Now, I would also point out that this really applies to that 7.75 zettabytes in particular. So the percentages here, I think play out pretty well. If we look at the data that is at the privacy layer, here we're really talking about email, browser history, things like that, that is not super critical, but certainly people want to have maintained at a private level and not disclosed to outside parties. The second light blue bar there you see, which is compliance, is retention, data that requires specific retention or has retention rules, perhaps is subject to litigation, maybe emails that are on hold, that kind of information. Custodial is more personally identifiable information. So that's things like your credit card or your social security number or other things that can be used by hackers and by dark web people to steal your identity. And then the third layer, the purple layer there, is trade secrets, customer lists, and so forth. And then the top layer, the orange, is the highest security, which would include financial transactions, classified information at a government level, as well as HIPAA information and things like that. So you can see that looking at that percentage, there's a tremendous amount of data that's going to require special handling in the future. In fact, if we look at that further, we can see that moving forward, more than 50% of data will require some kind of special handling, and it's up to about 75% of that data by 2025. And here now we can start to see the story unfold as to how tape can really fit into this digital transformation environment. All of these elements of data will be a part of the digital transformation just by the nature of the data that's being captured. Then the question becomes for the IT organization, how do data-centric organizations create a solution where this data can be appropriately handled and yet is available to the organization for better decision making? Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about what's happening with respect to IT organizations and the challenges that they're facing in providing data availability. Because if we look at digital transformation and we look at data-centric organizations, the fundamental requirement there is that the data be accurate and that it be available at all times. So what we're finding is that IT organizations are moving towards what we call the new race to zero, or the new drive to zero, which is really, if you get down to it, zero downtime with zero data loss, or a zero RPO, zero RTO. RTO stands for recovery time objective. RPO stands for recovery point objective. The recovery point objective is really the maximum amount of data you're willing to lose in the event of some kind of system failure. The recovery time objective is the amount of time that it takes to recover that data in the event of a disruption. What we find, though, is that right now the current best practice is about a 1-hour RTO, or recovery time, and about 15 minutes recovery point is about the most data that organizations are willing to lose. But if we don't have to go very far back where that number was 24 hours, which, if you think about it, a daily backup had a 24-hour RPO and a 24-hour RPO, and often hours in terms of recovering for the RTO. Now, organizations, as they move forward, are trying to find ways in which they can shorten that recovery point, lose less data, and shorten the recovery time. In other words, get the data available to the organization much faster. But the reason I bring this up is that there is really a dark side to this drive to zero, especially with respect to continuous replication. Organizations have adopted a variety of techniques, including synchronous replication, mirroring, clones, snapshots, and other methods in order to continuously drive down that SLA, or that RPO and that RTO. But when you do that, there is a dark side to it, which is that data, if it becomes corrupted or if some kind of malware is infected in the system, is automatically replicated over to the secondary site or to the backup site. So data corruption that enters the system through malware or ransomware or some other mechanism can be immediately replicated throughout the organization. In fact, one of the things that we're finding is that the hackers and the ransomware folks are really starting to target the backups before they actually target the the data itself. So they will work to corrupt the backup data so that if there's any kind of detection of the actual data, it's too late for the organization. They have actually already suffered a significant loss of that data. If we look at the evolution of data protection over time, you can see that this evolution has gone from a scenario where we really had discrete activities. Backup and recovery was a discrete activity. Data replication was discrete. But if you think about it, backup is really nothing more than a method of replicating data from one location to another. Then if we look at high availability, which required its own infrastructure, its own management, its own monitoring, and compare that to disaster recovery, my argument would be if I can recover data across geographic locations in a highly available manner, transparent to the application, have I not then just created a disaster recovery scenario? And I would argue that that's largely the case. We're also finding that archive, which used to be a discrete activity, you move the data off to a specific location, might have been tape, might have been really low-cost disk or other mechanisms. But those activities are really, in our new world, have really come into a continuum of different activities where data protection is evolving from a discrete set of tasks and is blending into technologies that are forming that continuum of availability. In many respects, that's a good thing because it allows us to implement infrastructure that is effective for many different use cases. But the bad news is, again, that continuum makes us more vulnerable to any kind of malware or ransomware or other mechanisms that might get into our system and infect the data itself. If we look at how data loss threat has evolved over time, this chart really is designed to take a look at how we've changed. If you look back at 1960 and you take a look at that dotted line at the top and you say that's 100%, really 100% of the data loss threats that we had to deal with back in the early mainframe days, the majority of them were technology errors. Both hardware and software was, of course, notoriously unreliable, certainly compared to these days. Human error was more common because there was a lot of human error involved. And we've always had to deal with site failures, natural disasters, and things like that. If we go all the way over to the right side of this chart and we look at 2018, we can see how that's changed. Really back in the 2010 timeframe, somewhere in that range, we started seeing malware and ransomware and other mechanisms being introduced that introduced a new data threat loss, whereas technology errors have diminished significantly. The reliability of hardware today and software today is really quite remarkable in terms of its failure, plus we've built in redundancy in terms of RAID, in terms of highly available processors, automatic failover. So really the impact we have from technology failures today is significantly reduced, as well as human error because we've automated so many human operations. And of course, we still continue to have the site failure and site disaster. But what I want to get across here is that if we look at the threats from data loss today, the majority of threats of loss are really from malware and ransomware. Those are the things that have evolved to being a significant problem for IT organizations to deal with. In order to deal with these different data loss threat scenarios, every IT organization has implemented a layered set of technologies in order to address different data loss threat scenarios and different RPO and different RTO requirements. So if we look at the strengths and weaknesses of the different solutions, you're going to start with tape backup and recovery, which on the strong side is actually very, very strong against malware because it provides an air gap, which we'll talk about in a little bit. You can do fast restores of large data sets. That's somewhat dependent upon the infrastructure that you have in terms of the number of tape drives and channels and things like that. But you really can restore large quantities of data very rapidly using tape. And it's also a very low cost per gigabyte. Really, there is no other technology today that is anywhere close to the cost per gigabyte of tape, and I don't anticipate that happening anytime soon. The weaknesses for tape, though, is that it has a relatively high RPO and RTO. If you do it once a day, your RPO is 24 hours. Your recovery time is dependent on the size of the data set, but could be anywhere from, say, 10 minutes to a few hours typically to restore data. So in order to improve those RTO times, organizations put in mirrors and clones, which provide very rapid failover or low RTO against hardware and software failure. The bad news is they can be very vulnerable to malware, and they're also very expensive. You've essentially doubled the cost of your storage or more, depending on how mirrors and clones you retain in order to be able to meet that particular business requirement. Synchronous replication gives you a very low RPO. The data loss threat or the amount of data loss is very low because you're synchronizing each transaction as it happens. The bad news, of course, is it's very vulnerable to malware. If I have a transaction that has become corrupted, I'm going to immediately synchronize that corrupted transaction over to my secondary copy. And as I mentioned, it's also very expensive along with mirrors and clones. Asynchronous replication gives you a lower RPO, not quite as low, and on the good news, it's really somewhat less vulnerable to malware, but it has to be staged properly in order to be able to defeat that malware and to put that air gap into place. Again, it's relatively expensive, and the remote RTO recovery time can actually be fairly long depending on the scenario. Snapshots give you a very low RPO and RTO, but again, they're very vulnerable to malware. So if we look at the key elements here and match up strengths and weaknesses for various scenarios, you'll find that there's really a very strong, tape has a very strong case against malware, whereas the other technologies are relatively weak. The reason tape is so strong in malware is that there is an inherent air gap. And what I mean by air gap is that there is a break in the connection between the data itself and the backup copy of the data. Back in the days when we were doing typical backup and recovery, 20 years ago, it was inherently air-gapped. We didn't know it at the time. We didn't call it that at the time. But that's inherently what it did is we'd make a copy. We'd take it out of the tape drives, perhaps out of the tape library, move it to a location secure, either on-site and or off-site, so that that data was available in the event of some kind of system failure or a site failure or another mechanism. But the bottom line here is that data was not accessible to any kind of corruption. It was corrupt, but it could not be affected by an outside piece of software at that point because it was then physically separated from the technology that was writing the data itself. And I think that is the most important point that we want to make today, is that tape can be used to introduce that air gap in your system in order to make sure that that you're protected from malware. Now, I also have to say it does require some thought and it does require some intelligent planning. If you recycle your tapes too frequently, then the air gap effect is probably nullified. But if you're able to keep that tape and keep sufficient numbers and copies of that tape off-site or even in the tape library or on-site in another repository, you will always have some place to go back where you will have reliable data where you can recover to that point. Not saying you won't lose data because you're going to, no matter what happens, but you can really lose the minimum amount of data by having a clever tape rotation environment and scheme put together based on the requirements of your organization. Now, you certainly can do this with disk replication, especially with asynchronous, in order to introduce that air gap into the system. But the difference is that it is generally at a very high cost. Tape today, again, can provide you with this full benefit of the air gap data protection for ransomware and do it at the lowest possible cost available in the industry. I'd like to now take a quick look at some of the summaries of LTO specifically and some of the strengths within LTO. As most of you know, LTO has really become the standard for open systems tape environments today. There may be some other corner cases and certainly some within some different use cases like media and entertainment, but LTO tape has really become the industry standard over the past several years, and I expect that to continue over the next number of years. And a lot of it is because it does help you to recover very large data sets rapidly. Again, you need to have the appropriate infrastructure in place depending on what your RPO and your recovery time requirements are. You need to make sure that you have enough tape drives and enough tape channels and so forth. But if you contemplate trying to recover the petabytes of information that we were talking about as part of the global Datasphere and recovering that to a system even from the cloud, moving huge amounts of data from the cloud is generally not possible for most organizations. Cloud is a great place to store data. It's off-site. You can use it to introduce air gaps if you do it cleverly, but to be able to recover and restore that data can be very, very time-consuming. So tape still continues to fill that role of a rapid recovery of very large data sets. It's also a key part of back-of-it recovery operations, again, to introduce that inherent air gap when you do the backup. Now, what I would recommend for most IT organizations is that they continue to do snapshots and mirrors and clones and all the other replication to give them the necessary RPO and RTO. But I would also recommend that they can continue to implement their daily backups as they are currently in order to have that data protection air gap available to them. It is also gives you very long storage times at very low cost because there's no power and cooling associated with storing a tape. And it also has worm capabilities, or write once, read many, which is what WORM stands for, meaning that the data can be put onto the tape in such a manner that it cannot be overwritten. Again, this is important when you start to think about malware or ransomware. The way those products work is they go in and they start reorganizing the data. In fact, one of the ways you can detect them is to suddenly see a sudden spike of I/O activity as they reorganize data and as they move data around in order to be able to lock and corrupt that data. The worm capabilities of tape prevent anyone from doing that. Even if for some way someone was able to get into those tapes, say they're still online or whatever, the data on a worm device cannot be overwritten. So it does give an extra layer of protection for organizations that need to be sure that the data is available and not corrupted. Some of the key use cases then for tape when supporting a digital transformation initiative and cloud computing are, first of all, to address the lockdown and compliance data that we talked about in the global Datasphere. If 75% of the data is going to require some kind of special handling, certainly I would argue that the tape can play a very important role in that protection of that data to meet governance and other compliance requirements. We also know that it can store and serve very large sequentially accessed data such as medical images or oil and gas, geophysical information. It's also ideally suited for entertainment video, which is very high-speed streaming data. Video surveillance is one that's really coming online. The number of video devices or video cameras out there for security are actually quite amazing. If we think just very recently to the Austin bomber in Texas, when he went into the facility at a FedEx location to place his packages, I think there were 13 different cameras that caught his image. So the video surveillance images are really expanding exponentially in that global data sphere, and tape is an ideal way to capture that data. Also, archive data, tape is probably still far and away the most efficient mechanism for archiving data, and that includes in the cloud. You would be surprised how many of the cloud service providers out there use tape on the back end for their archive as a service applications. It still serves a very strong role within that environment, and it certainly does for on-premise IT organizations as well. And then finally, IoT and other research data that can be captured and retained and need to be retained for long periods of time. Tape certainly fits into that requirement very well as well. What I want to emphasize with this little analogy here about learning a lesson from breakfast is that if you look at each one of the components of the breakfast items I have on here, each one of them has certainly health benefits. The milk has calcium, the eggs have protein, the cereal has grain, we see the fruit, we see the vitamin C, all the things that go into it. No one of those components provides that complete nutritional value by itself. It's really putting them together that provides you with all of the nutrition that you need in order to fuel your body. And quite similarly, if we look at that in terms of using that analogy in terms of robust data protection strategy, I think we can see that all of these components fit very well together in order to provide that component, that complete strategy. Certainly none of these technologies alone will give you the kind of data protection that you need, nor the kind of RPO and RTO that you need in every scenario. So our guidance to IT organizations is to take a layered approach to your data protection and to utilize those elements for what they're really good for. Snapshots are really good for frequent backup and very low RPO. Mirrors and clones for restoring a large database very quickly. Asynchronous replication for being able to store data over long distances. Synchronous to be able to get down to a transaction level type of recovery. And then, of course, tape, being able to give that air gap capability in a ransomware environment, as well as long-term data storage at a very low cost. So to summarize, the role of tape in digital transformation really is that tape may well be the best technology and best position to provide recovery from malware and ransomware at the lowest possible cost. Again, there are ways to introduce air gaps into systems, but they tend to be more fallible because they're dependent upon human intervention. They can be circumvented as well by hackers. Clever hackers can find ways around some of those. But there's really no way a hacker can find a way to a tape that is stored outside a library or in a vault or some other location where it simply physically cannot be located. Tape also meets data protection requirements that other technologies cannot at a very competitive price. And I think that's an important point, that you certainly want to meet the business's requirements with respect to data protection and with respect to the RPO and the RTO that you have, but to do it at the lowest possible cost. There's no advantage, there's no competitive advantage to spending more on a data protection function that's going to deliver additional value to your organization. So you really want to do it at the lowest possible cost. Tape is also well suited to protect specific classes of data in the global data sphere, as we talked about, and we think that's true well into the 2020s. LTO As we talked about, is an industry standard technology with a well-defined roadmap. It's supported by all the major vendors in the industry, and that roadmap is very well published. They're very open and very transparent about what their future plans are and what they will deliver and when they will deliver it. And in that regard, we'll take a quick look at the LTO Technology Roadmap here. You can see today we're on Gen 8, where we have 12 terabyte native cartridges. And really, with each generation of tape, the organization has been pretty consistent at doubling or nearly doubling both the capacity as well as the throughput of the individual tapes, as well as the tape drives and tape devices themselves. So right now, we know that there's 4 more generations of tapes specified through LTO. The organization will continue to add to that over time, but you can see that the future of LTO tape is bright and has a very high capacity future. With that, I would like to thank you for your attention. Now what we'd like to do is break over to the question and answer period. I'm going to be joined by 3 other hosts on this panel: Laura Laredo from HPE, Carlos Sandoval from IBM, and Eric Basier from Quantum. And so I'm going to start with the basic question. I'm going to start with Laura. First question that I have that came in is, with the increased number of ransomware attacks this past year, how can LTO technology create a barrier between data and hackers? Do you want to take that, Laura?
Yes, thank you, I will. Well, I think you explained that very well over your presentation, and basically LTO technology provides an offline storage. So what we mean with this is that data cannot be accessed electronically by cyber attacks. So making tape in this way the only true storage medium that provides that air gap protection for your data from these cyber attacks. So by keeping your data backed up and offline on tape, you know you have a set of data that is very, very hard to steal. So for example, imagine a ransomware attack where your data has been encrypted and the hackers are asking for some Bitcoin, really, to give you the key for that encrypted data. They would not have had access to your offline copy of the data on tape. So what you can do is then recover that data, restore from the tape, and go back to a set of data that you know hasn't been infected by the ransomware, and you are up and running.
Yep. In fact, I think that's probably the most effective way to do it. Certainly the simplest, easiest method of doing it is what you described there with how you separate those tapes. Second question we have, I think, is going to go to, I think this one should go to you, Carlos. How does LTO Technology's security features compare to other forms of digital storage technologies such as disk and cloud?
Hi, Phil. Well, the LTO technology has various features that help us to protect data, and I will highlight 3 of them. One is the air gap that was already mentioned by Laura and also widely described during your presentation, and well, that keeps our data offline, and it represents the highest level of safeguard against cyber attacks. The second one, LTO technology delivers powerful tape drive-based 256-bit AES encryption, and that provides an effective layer of security for sensitive data on tapes, either at rest or in transit. Exposing confidential or private information can be very costly for companies. And the third one, LTO technology also provides Swarm, that you also described. This is the Write Once, Read Many media, which is designed to provide users a very cost-effective means of storing data in a non-rewritable format to address compliance regulations. And in summary, the LTO technology provides a very inexpensive solution to make an extra copy of your data for offsite data protection for disaster recovery in case of natural disaster, human error, and well, some of the things that you describe in one of your charts. So that's basically what I would highlight in these terms.
Very good, Carlos. I had not talked about encryption, but that's a really good point. Tapes typically are encrypted at a hardware level within the drive itself, and we prescribe that as a best practice for any organization whenever you move data offsite, really on-site these days too. Data should be encrypted, so that's a really good point. Eric, let me send this next one to you. With data amounts increasing each year, how does the LTO program plan to address industry needs?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. And thank you for everybody for attending. One of the great things about LTO as a technology now is we actually have a roadmap that calls for a doubling in capacity with every generation of LTO. So for those that are interested, we have the new roadmap that is available and published on LTO.org. We just recently released LTO 8. We made some really significant innovations in the technology to be able to double capacity versus LTO 7. So an LTO 8 cartridge has 12 terabyte native or up to 30 terabyte compressed, so quite dense. And I'm pretty excited about the future of LTO technology because some of the innovations that we've made make us feel really confident that we can have a roadmap that doubles in capacity every few years. We've published the roadmap now up through LTO 12 or up through 12 generations, and you guys can go check that out. That gets us to reaching up to 192 terabyte native per tape. And I think that's how we're going to keep up with that. I don't remember the exact term you used, but the zettabyte scale data, that's how we're going to do it.
Very good. Thank you. I think the remarkable thing is the roadmap that you guys have and how you are able to double capacity and throughput from generation to generation. Next question we have, I think I'll take this one because I think it's pretty much directed to me. Which costs are you comparing to support the claim of low cost for tape? That's a good one because it does get into a cost accounting exercise to some degree. And really what we're looking at there is the cost of per gigabyte on that it costs to store a gigabyte of data on tape. You can, the very low level, you could take a $50 tape or $80 tape, whatever they are. I haven't priced them in a while, but and then divided by the 12 gigabytes or 30 gigabytes. Now that's at the very basic level, and it doesn't include the hardware cost. So when you get into the cost of tape drives, tape libraries, and things like that, you start to have to get into assumptions as to how many pieces of media you have associated with the tape library and the tape devices themselves. So depending on what assumptions you make, that cost accounting exercise is going to change. But really, if you look at that, and even in comparison to the very low cost cloud storage, the cloud on a per gigabyte is very low, but you got to remember you pay it every month. There's also ingress and egress charges associated with moving data in and out of the cloud. So cloud can be very economical for many reasons, but I think when you look at the total amount of storing high capacities of data for long periods of time, tape is pretty hard to beat. Next one, I think this is... Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, Phil, sorry to interject. If you don't mind, it is a great question. I was going to mention to the audience that for those interested, we actually have a really nice TCO calculator on the LTO.org website. And you can answer a few simple questions about kind of your environment, the amount of data you have, annual growth rate, things like that. And we actually compare the long-term total cost of LTO against other technologies in the industry like object stores, Amazon Glacier, Oracle Archive, Google Nearline, it's a pretty objective way where if someone wants to get a sense of what it looks like for your environment, it's a good tool, really user-friendly. So just wanted to put a plug in for that as well.
Good point. Thanks for that, Eric. I think I will give this next one to you as well, Eric, since I got you here. What data amounts, or I'm sorry, we got that one covered. I think we're all good there. I don't see any other questions that have come in. Any final thoughts, Eric, Carlos, Laura, that you would like to add?
Well, this is Carlos.
And none for me. Thank you.
I would just like to add that we have in the attachments section of this webinar, there is this white paper that IDC created related to this topic, so I'm inviting audience to download it, and it's also available at the LTO.org website under the white paper section.
Very good. And I think we're just about at the end of our time for this. I would like to thank everyone who attended today for attending. I'll remind you that you will be receiving a link from today's presentation, which you're welcome to utilize, forward to other people. Again, there are some wonderful resources on the LTO.org website in terms of the cost calculator that Eric mentioned, in terms of the white papers that Carlos mentioned. So please, let's keep the conversation going, and hope this information has been helpful for you today. A good day, and we'll speak to you soon.